Okay, I think the number of people joining is beginning to slow down, so I will begin to introduce the session as a couple of people join, and then we'll kind of kick off into the content. But welcome everybody, thank you very much for joining us. So you've joined a session on unpacking Tazo's new invitations to tender. You may have already seen these opportunities on our website and across our social channels. We have a kind of series or a number of new projects starting in September. And today is just an information session to talk you through exactly what we're planning, but also mostly to answer any questions that you have as well. You've joined a webinar format of a Zoom meeting, so you won't be able to see or hear each other or yourselves. Don't worry, that's okay. It's planned that way. So we will present content to you, and then we will conduct a question and answer session using the Q&A function. So you should be able to see on your taskbar a Q&A kind of chat box, and you can submit your questions in there throughout the session this morning, and then we will do our best to answer all of those questions. There are quite a few people joining this morning, and obviously multiple projects that we're going to talk to you about. So we will do our very best to get to all of your questions, but if your question is not answered for any reason, please don't worry. What we will do is wrap up with a kind of written FAQs document, and we'll try and publish that as soon as possible, hopefully by the end of the week as well. But hopefully we'll get to as many of the questions as we possibly can. Just letting a couple more people join before we kick off into the content, but as we do that, I'll just briefly introduce myself. So I am Rain Sherlock. I'm the head of evaluation here at Tazo, so working across the kind of research and evaluation portfolio, and we'll also be contributing to the projects that we're going to talk you through today. I've also got my colleague Rob Summers on the call. Rob, would you like to briefly introduce yourself?
Hello, I'm a research manager at Tazo, so I'll be managing one of the projects that we're going to be talking about later, the Institutional Data Use Project, and kicking off the management of the Supporting Disabled Students project as well.
Thank you, Rob. So for anyone who's joined in the last couple of moments, hopefully you're in the right place. This is a Tazo webinar on unpacking the new invitations to tenders that we've launched. And we will be talking you through some content on each project, and then we'll be allocating quite a lot of time for questions at the end. So please do use the Q&A chat function that you should be able to see in your taskbar and submit questions as we go. I think we'll kick off. So just a very brief outline for the session. I'm going to run you through some kind of top level key information that applies to all of the opportunities. We'll also then take one project at a time and just introduce you to what our kind of vision or hope is for each project. And then, as I said, we'll leave quite a lot of time for questions, so please do pop those in. So the first thing to note is that we've got the same deadline for every opportunity that's currently live on the website. So all of these funding opportunities will close at 5 p.m. on Friday, the 4th of August, so just over a month now. You're welcome to respond to multiple tenders. A couple of people have already emailed and been asking about this. So you're welcome to apply to both the kind of ethnicity degree awarding gap project and the support for disabled student project, for instance. And we will review each of those applications separately in their separate buckets attached to each project. All of these projects are due to start in September. So between the closing date on the 4th of August and September, we'll be going through a kind of standardized shortlisting process, and our plan is to then have initial kickoff meetings for each project in September. And this will become clear as we go, but just to address that up front, there are different or kind of varied grant funding pots associated with each of these projects. Some of the projects come with grant funding allocated to higher education providers, and we'll kind of talk you through what that looks like per project in a moment. So the first new project that we're going to be launching and working on is a project following the launch of our ethnicity degree awarding gaps report, which some of you may have seen. This was launched a couple of weeks ago. And it was a kind of scoping research project to understand what the current landscape looks like for different interventions or activities or programs being run to try and reduce the ethnicity degree awarding gap. So that is quite simply just the gap between BAME and white learners. whilst they're at university. So we did a review of access and participation plans, and we also spoke to quite a lot of stakeholders to understand what sort or types of interventions were being delivered in higher education providers at the moment. And what the report outlines is that there are 16 common approaches or types of intervention that look to address this gap, but a real lack of theory of change and also evaluation plans for what the efficacy of that might look like, or what we think the activities will contribute to in terms of change or outcomes for students or learners. So this is kind of like a scoping project. It's similar to something we recently did on the topic of interventions that look to raise attainment of school-age pupils. And what we're going to be doing is seeking up to 6 higher education providers to work with both TASO and an independent evaluator from TASO's panel of evaluators to design and build theory of change models and evaluation plans that kind of sequentially and quite strategically talk through how different interventions should lead to outcomes and impacts for students. So we will seek a range of kind of types of higher education providers, but also types of intervention that look to address the ethnicity degree awarding gap. And the idea is that we will then publish each of these theories of change and begin to build a kind of set of archetypes for how theories of change in this space can look and aid other people also working on similar interventions. So the 6 providers that we work with on this project will be expected to commit some resource and kind of time and energy and thought to the project. So there'll be a series of regular meetings with the independent evaluator, whom TASO will fund and also appoint to the project. There'll also be a series of workshops, theory of change workshops. So there'll be some effort and kind of time required from the higher education provider to make sure that we can get all of the correct and relevant people in a room to conduct these theories of change workshops. That will be a combination of evaluators, delivery staff, senior stakeholders where relevant, possibly even students. And then also from the higher education provider to review the theories of change and kind of provide feedback on how we might be able to operationalize that into an evaluation plan in your specific context for your specific intervention. So this is all just to say that there is some time and resource required, and to make sure that is accounted for and represented in your proposal. There are a number of key outputs that you would get as a higher education provider partner on this project. So the first is 2 theories of change. One is a core theory of change, and the second is an enhanced theory of change. You can read much more about these theory of change models on the TASO website, but very simply, a core theory of change is a kind of high-level one-pager that talks through the sort of general strategic direction of why we expect certain activities to lead to certain outcomes. That's what we'll start with, and what each HEP will work with with their independent evaluator. There'll then be a series of workshops to turn this into what we think of as an enhanced theory of change, which is just a much more comprehensive model or map with a quite lengthy underpinning narrative that talks through exactly how and why we expect each component of a program or an activity to lead to specific outcomes, and underpinned by change mechanisms to eventually have impact for students and impact on reducing the ethnicity degree awarding gap. We will also then take these 2 theories of change, so the core and the enhanced version, and turn them into an evaluation plan. So this is working quite closely with the independent evaluator to understand what the kind of key design or methodology could be for operationalizing the theory of change, what the specific or most relevant data collection points might be. Are there measurement tools that we could attach to each outcome? So basically, how do we turn it from a theoretical document about how we expect change to occur into something that could be implemented or operationalized within your context? As mentioned, this project is due to start in September, and it's a relatively short, snappy project, which we would like to wrap before Christmas, so by the end of December 2023. So definitely enough time, but will be quite rapid in terms of setup and then also getting the workshops scheduled in and underway. I'm not going to pause for questions just there. We're going to continue to talk you through the other 2 projects. and then we'll take all the questions at the end, if that's okay, because I think there'll be some similarity. So I'm going to hand over to Rob to talk you through our next project.
Thanks, Rain. So this project is looking at using institutional data as a means of building better evaluation of the student experience. And it's based on the fact that recent projects of ours have demonstrated the power of institutional data analysis. Our online teaching and learning in the time of COVID project demonstrated a relationship between the attainment gap between students from disadvantaged backgrounds and non-disadvantaged backgrounds as a result of the move to online teaching. And our learner analytics project is demonstrating how the power of the large sample size is available in institutions to understand the effects of student support interventions for students who are disengaged. But the effective analysis and generalization of these results is difficult. In our online teaching and learning project, the data we had was from one higher education provider, but only from a partial sample of that. And the way some of the data was coded made it difficult to actually analyze within its context. At best, you get institutional data analysed just by the institute, just for the whole subset of the population of the institution, but often it's much a smaller subset than that. And also, our learner analytics project outcomes were hindered by the fact there was no effective tracking of the post-entry student interventions. So many of you will be aware of trackers like HEAT, Aim Higher, and MBREP. These are pre-entry access trackers. So they are databases that institutions can use to record who they've interacted with on outreach work and widening participation work. But within institutions, the tracking of post-entry student interventions is generally quite poor and not sort of well developed at the moment. So we're looking to work with up to 4 HE providers to map post-entry activities and outcomes. And we're going to fund an evaluator to look at how institutional data can be used to evaluate those post-entry activities that the providers have. So each, the successful providers, they can bid for up to £20,000 each for staff and resources to contribute to a framework for mapping post-entry activities and outcomes. So similar again to the pre-entry typology that's now quite well established in the sector, we're hoping to produce a post-entry activities and outcomes typology. If you're in a small N provider, or if you've got a group of providers together who've collaborated, you could also apply together as a joint bid for 120k pot. Part of this, the idea of this project is to encourage collaboration across institutions. And also we'll expect you to assist an independent evaluator in the scoping and evaluation of your post-entry interventions. If you have the analysis skills to do that, then you'll be able to work more closely perhaps with the independent evaluator in terms of the analyses. But if you don't have the analysis skills, that's why we've got the independent evaluator in there. There are going to be 3 broad outputs from the project. First is this framework or typology for mapping post-entry activities and outcomes. And so the kind of post-entry activities that we're thinking about are anything that will reduce inequalities in the student experience. So they can be simple as timetabling changes, but they could be study support, peer mentoring, changes to teaching, digital provision for disadvantaged students, all that kind of thing. Although if your interventions in this case are aimed at the ethnicity degree awarding gap, we would encourage you to look at the previous ITT that Rain's talked about. And if the intervention is to do with supporting disabled students, then we'd encourage you to go towards the ITT that I'm going to describe after this. Also, we hope to produce guidance on using and developing higher education infrastructure to facilitate the tracking of post-entry activities and outcomes. And finally, there'll be a concrete evaluation of each provider's intervention. And the project is expected to start in September, and we're looking for final outputs to be delivered in March next year. Our final invitation to tender starts off similarly to our institutional data use project. So this will be supporting disabled students in terms of developing evidence-based transition support and improving data use. Our recent report on what works to reduce equality gaps for disabled students suggests that while there is quite a lot of what we call type 3 or causal evidence that suggests that transition support is effective for disability inclusion, there is little evidence from a UK context. And so we need an evaluation of effective strategies as transition support improves and expands across the sector. So two key topics that we're going to be addressing in this ITT. We want to develop an evidence-based model for consistent support across the higher education sector. We also, as we're talking about before, we want to make best use of the data so we can map the barriers and opportunities in using the data for evaluation. In this tender, we'll be selecting up to 3 providers. Again, they'll be able to bid for up to £20,000 for staff and resources. And with the support of an independent evaluator, we'll be reviewing existing evidence on transition support and sharing local evidence. Got quite a lot of experience to suggest there's quite a lot of locally very good practice going on, but it's not shared nationally. We'll also be developing an enhanced theory of change. So this is the theory of change that Rain was talking about, that includes a narrative structure, evidence for the efficacy of the interventions, if it exists, and linkages, causal linkages between the activities that are designed and the impact that is expected. And collaborate with the TASO-funded evaluator to design an evidence-based model for transition support. And as part of this project, the providers will also contribute to the mapping of activities, outcomes and data for post-entry work in the institutional data use project that I've just talked about. And again, this project is expected to start in September 23, and there'll be final outputs delivered in February 2024.
Thank you very much, Rob. So just to summarize then and kind of look across the piece briefly. So we've got the Ethnicity Degree Awarding Gaps Project, EDAG is the acronym there. And for this project, we're looking to partner with 6 higher education providers. There won't be grant funding flowing from TASO to the higher education providers for this project. The support will come in the form of an independent evaluator. So instead, the funding is going to be funneled to find an independent evaluator that will then set up and run these workshops with you as higher education providers. The second project, one of the projects that Rob then talked through, we call IDU, which is just institutional data use. Here we're looking to partner with 4 higher education providers, and each of those providers is able to apply for up to £20,000 in grant funding. So that will flow directly from TASO to 4 higher education providers, and that's 20k each, not split between the 4 providers. Although, as Rob pointed out, you are welcome to bid as a kind of small consortium of providers, and this might be particularly relevant for small or specialist providers. And if you were to bid as a consortium, then that £20,000 would be split between you as a group. That should be clear from the invitation to tender, but very happy to take questions on that here. And then again, we will also be seeking to appoint an independent evaluator to support that project. So it will be a kind of 3-way project partnership between TASO, the higher education providers that are selected, and the independent evaluator who will work with all of the providers across the piece. And then the model is very similar for the third project, although the content is obviously very different. So the third project is support for disabled students, SDS. Here we're looking to appoint up to 3 higher education providers. Again, each of those providers is eligible to apply to up to £20,000 in grant funding. And again, we will appoint an independent evaluator, a separate independent evaluator to support the higher education providers in the project. So again, that becomes a kind of three-way partnership between TASO, the higher education providers, and the independent evaluator. Hopefully that is a kind of clear summary and helps us get into the detail a little bit about what each of the projects will cover. I'm going to launch us into a Q&A in just a moment, and I can see that there are quite a few questions trickling in, but before I do so, we've just got a quick poll, if that's okay, to take a kind of temperature in the room. So our question is, which of the following invitations to tender are you most likely to apply to? Give us an indication. I'm just going to leave that there for a moment. I can see people are responding, so take your time to click. Interesting. So it's looking pretty similar for institutional data use and supporting disabled students, with a higher percentage interested in the EDAGs addressing the ethnicity degree awarding gap. Cool. Okay, it's slowed down, so I think we will leave that there, but thank you very much. So to come on to questions, what I might do is actually just unshare my screen, and then I'll be able to address the Q&A. So we've got quite a few questions flowing in. Let's see how we go and answer what we can here. And as I mentioned at the beginning, what we can't, we'll pick up in an offline FAQs document. So the first question I can take, which is, so Lydia Fletcher is asking for the ethnicity degree awarding gaps project with theories of change. Is this intended to develop a theory of change for just one activity, or could it be an overarching theory of change that addresses, for instance, an awarding gap strategy, so many different activities looped into one program? The short answer is it can be either. We're super happy to look at bids or applications that take just one activity or one intervention and build both a core and enhanced theory of change for that more granular, quite specific activity. But equally, we're very happy to work with projects that have more of a kind of reducing the gap strategy, as Lydia has put it, or what we might think of as a kind of multi-intervention outreach program or multi-intervention kind of support program. And the main thing to consider is that the theory of change will obviously look quite different. So we might have a number of key activities in a multi-intervention program, and then we would map the sort of high level, short, intermediate, long-term outcomes and impact overall. But either is fine in terms of applying. There will just be a set of considerations when it then comes to developing the theory of change and also, perhaps more importantly, developing the evaluation plan, because we'll need to consider how best to evaluate a multi-intervention program, which is obviously quite different to a single activity or intervention. But these are very common evaluation challenges and definitely things that we can work with and address throughout the project. So to take them sequentially, our next question then is one for you, I think, Rob. This is on the institutional data use project. And it says, please could you define the concrete evaluation at the end of the project? What methodologies is this likely to include?
Okay, yes, so the concrete evaluation will be hopefully something that generates what we call type 3 or causal evidence. So likely in this case, not a randomized control trial, but it might be quasi-experimental or differences approaches, but also associative correlational evidence as well will be absolutely fine.
Thanks, Rob. And then while we're on that, is it one intervention that the higher education provider should consider putting forward?
That's a good question. It's not one I'd considered. Yes, I think generally it would be one intervention, but if it's a basket of interventions that have a coherent theory of change behind them, then that would also be considered. But I will go back to the team on that one and think about it, and we'll put it in our FAQ question, FAQ document that we'll send out afterwards.
Super, thank you. And then we've got a couple of kind of operational questions coming in, which I can briefly cover off. So the first is, how will TASO be selecting an independent evaluator? And apologies, because if you're not aware of our panel of evaluators, this may have, we kind of flew through it at the beginning, but At Tazo, we work with a core group of evaluators that make up what we call our panel of evaluators. It's quite a common kind of model or mechanism for appointing independent evaluators within the What Works network, and Tazo is a member of the What Works network. So this panel was appointed coming up for 2 years ago now, via an open call. So we put out a kind of open invitation to tender, not dissimilar to the invitation to tender we're talking about today, for evaluation organizations that might be higher education providers, it might be a kind of independent research organization, it might be a large kind of evaluator. And then we shortlisted each of these applications, we interviewed and we appointed the kind of top 10 evaluators based on our marking metric, who are now part of a closed panel of evaluators that came from that open call a number of years ago. So when we are seeking an independent evaluator, what we do is we write an invitation to tender that is very similar to the version that is released to higher education providers, and that now goes to our closed panel of evaluators, and each of those evaluators have equal opportunity to bid for all or one or some of the invitations to tender that are live, and we will select and appoint evaluators based on that process. You can see who's on the panel. If you just Google Tazo panel of evaluators, it should come up. There are a number of higher education providers who are part of that panel, as well as the Behavioural Insights team and kind of NFER and some other bigger research organizations. So feel free to go and check that out. And then we have another question, which is, can you please provide some more specific information on what costs are eligible to be claimed within the £20,000? So this is a really good question. It's a model that we have used quite a lot over the last couple of years at Tazo. So we will give out kind of pots of grant funding that flow from Tazo straight to the higher education providers. And it can be used for a number of things. So in the past, we have had people submit budgets that include kind of hiring new staff or research assistants. So it will largely just go on salaries and wages. And you, as a higher education provider, would need to be responsible for kind of recruiting and appointing someone with a suitable skill set to support and conduct the project. And that's absolutely fine. It's worked quite nicely in the past. But similarly, sometimes people will use it just to cover staff costs and allocate staff that are already working within the provider or within the team, just allocate their time to the project, and use that to cover costs that are associated with already existing kind of internal budgets. It can also be used for things like kind of thinking of the EDAGs, ITT, although that actually doesn't have HEP grant funding, but it can be used for things like travel to workshops, renting conference rooms for workshops, kind of general expenses and running costs of setting up a project like this. Obviously, the cost of the independent evaluator is covered separately and appointed by Tazo, so there's no need to include any independent evaluation support as part of your budgets. So moving on, where to start? We've got a couple of questions about the third project we introduced, so the supporting disabled students. One question, can you please describe the group of disabled students? Rob, do you want to start us there, and then I'm happy to jump in as well.
I think it would be any student that considers themselves to be disabled and would benefit from support to address that in the transition to study at higher education.
Yeah, absolutely. And we do have what we call a kind of rapid evidence review on this topic. So if you, again, maybe we will include this in the FAQs at the end, the relevant links that I'm referencing in terms of panel of evaluators and the support for disabled students report. But there is a rapid evidence review that talks about the type of support that already exists and the types of student that support seeks to kind of help. So it might be a nice place to start if you're thinking about considering applying to this ITT, to just review that report and understand what our understanding of the current landscape is, because we're very much picking up from the recommendations of that first report in terms of building what the model or methodology for this second project is going to look like. But exactly as Rob has said, we're basically looking to support the transition of all students who declare a form of disability at the point of transitioning from into higher education, and how that could be kind of smoothed out and aided. So we've got another question for the IDU project, institutional data use. So could the IDU project include use of institutional progression data and activities that are provided as part of the career provision, or is the intention just to look at only access data?
Well, our intention is not really to look at access data, but actually data generated while the student is at university. So any post-entry intervention. Careers provision is likely to be outside of the scope of that unless the aims of the intervention include an impact on students' attainment while they're at university.
Super, thank you very much. So there's a few quick questions that I'm just going to try and address. One question from Henrik is asking, can a single institution bid for more than one project essentially? And the answer is yes. So if a higher education provider is interested in both the ethnicity degree awarding gaps theory of change project and the institutional data use project, you're very welcome to bid for both. Please do be mindful that there's some overlap in terms of the institutional data use and support for disabled students. It's been intentionally designed in that way, and we are trying to encourage kind of collaboration and cross fertilization again across the sector. But if you've got sort of distinct interventions and separate teams working on separate kind of APP briefs, then absolutely one institution can apply to more than one project. I've got a couple of questions that I'm going to group into one, which are broadly asking about the kind of selection process for HE providers. So what criteria are you looking for? It varies across each of the projects, and I'm not going to cover this in huge detail because it is outlined in the bottom of the invitation to tender in quite a lot of detail. So if you scroll down towards the end of each specific invitation to tender, you will see a kind of bunch of selection criteria, and they're also weighted. So you can see the weight attached to each criterion, but broadly we will look to assess the kind of types of interventions you're working with, the team and the personnel that you're proposing will work on the project. And then there's a kind of question around feasibility in terms of what the budget is that you're applying to, but they do vary slightly across the invitations to tender. So please do make sure that you're looking at the very specific criteria and weighting for the invitations to tender that you're responding to. And if you are applying to multiple invitations to tender, again, just be mindful that those criteria do change ever so slightly depending on the project. So again, another quick question. There is a question around the funding for the ethnicity degree awarding gaps project. So just to be clear, it's possible that someone joined the webinar in the last couple of minutes. There is no grant funding attached to the ethnicity degree awarding gap project for higher education providers directly. Instead, that funding is being directed to appoint an independent evaluator. And then the support that the higher education providers will receive is the kind of work and support of that independent evaluator. So you will be guided through a series of kind of theory of change workshops that will be facilitated and hosted by the independent evaluator. And you will the outputs will be yours to use in terms of the theories of change and the evaluation plan, and should aid and support the kind of operationalization of your evaluation moving forward. Bear with me, just scrolling through questions. So, Rob, we've got another question on institutional data use, although I think it could also be relevant to support for disabled students. So is the institutional data project strictly limited to post-entry? For example, our institution have embarked on RCT on a light touch outreach intervention with the outcome of interest in or applications to acceptances on our own institution. This is captured via institutional data, including UCAS data. We envision including this in an overarching tackling framework using institutional data use, including post-entry work.
So there is potential that a pre-entry program might be considered as part of this, if the pre-entry program is primarily has a large component that is designed to support students on their transition to university, and where the aim is to reduce the attainment gap for widening participation students versus non-WP students. So if that is part of your outreach program, and you can track those students into your university, and you can and you've got the data to look at that, then yes, that would be considered. But in general, pre-entry programs wouldn't be, unless they've got some a significant component that is designed to reduce post-entry inequality.
Thank you, Rob. And then also on institutional data use, oh, I just lost the question, but it was asking how many interventions are appropriate to include in the bid.
That it sort of depends. If they're a coherent basket of interventions with one coherent theory of change behind them, then it's okay to include more than one. In general, we would likely imagine it would be a single intervention, but a well-constructed group of interventions would receive equal consideration.
Thank you. Then I've got a general question on multiple higher education providers applying together. It's not clear which project this is for, but it applies to both institutional data use and support for disabled students. So the question is, if small higher education institutions bid together for the £20,000, would they count as one higher education institution? I'm not sure I've entirely understood the question. So it's Catherine Little, if you would like to clarify, but if I have understood the question, the answer is basically that we're welcoming multiple providers to come in together on one bid, and that the £20,000 of grant funding would then be split between those providers. So if you already work with or have good relationships with other providers and you think that together you would have a strong application, you're very welcome to fund as a group of higher education providers or institutions. But in that scenario, the funding, the £20,000 would be split between you. So there are basically 4 pots of £20,000 for the institutional data use project and 3 pots of £20,000 for the support for disabled students project. But yeah, if that doesn't answer your question, then do let us know. Another one for institutional data use. So would there need to already be an established theory of change for this intervention?
Not necessarily, but you almost certainly would have to develop one in order to assist with the evaluator and the evaluation that occurs.
Thank you, Rob. And then another disabled students support project question. So how fixed are things in terms of the definition of transition, i.e. would the intention to be focused on transition from pre-entry into uni level study, or some students become disabled whilst at uni and would only be aware of this disability after entry? It's a really nice question. I don't know, Rob, if you want to answer that, or if not, I'm happy to.
Yeah, it's a good question. I hadn't considered it. So I think I'll leave that with you, Rain, actually.
Yeah, it is a really good question. I think we'll definitely take away and think about it and include it in the FAQs. But I think we would want to cover both as a short answer. So we have been imagining transition as how to kind of smooth the process of students who have declared some form of disability through the process of joining higher education and making sure that they get the on-course support that is required to help them succeed whilst at higher education. But of course, success at higher education also includes those who become disabled whilst having started already and whilst at university or HE. So we'll definitely take that away and think about how to kind of build it into the overall project, but also come back to you in the FAQs to help inform your applications. Make sure we've got it really clear, but basically both. We've got lots of questions on ethnicity degree awarding gaps, which I am going to group and answer in a moment. But sorry, while we're just still on IDU and disabled students, so another institutional data use question for you, Rob. Would the intervention have to be well established, or could it be at a kind of more pilot stage?
Either.
Yeah, agree. Either is fine. Okay, let's come to some of these ethnicity degree awarding gap projects. So to just take them in order. So we've got one question. So for the EDAGs, would TASO prefer an intervention that was within one of the kind of 16 types that's outlined by the report, or could it be something that's not included in that list? Again, the short answer here is either is fine. We are particularly interested to work with and understand the types of intervention that have been included in the report, so those 16 intervention types. But that doesn't mean that we would entirely rule out types of intervention that aren't clearly coded or categorized under those 16 types. So either is fine. I'm sure this is very kind of obvious, but please just make it clear in your application. So if your intervention or your program fits within one of those 16 types, please just make sure that you kind of code or label that in some way so that it's clear to us exactly what you're working with. And we've got, so can you apply to review a project for the ethnicity degree awarding gaps tender that will commence in September and aimed at awarding a gap in a specific faculty? So yes, you can. It's fine to be working with an intervention that is due to start in the new academic year, and it's also fine if it's working in a very specific context within the overall kind of higher education landscape. I imagine that the applications we receive for this project are going to be super varied, in that some of them will be interventions that have already been run, some of them will be interventions that are still being kind of set up and designed, and some of them will be in very specific contexts, while some of them might be, as we had earlier, a question that's much more kind of strategic and broad about the multiple types of activity that might take place to reduce these gaps overall. So we welcome everything within that quite widely distributed types of bids. Another ethnicity degree awarding gap question is, will there be any support from TASO to implement the evaluation plan later? So that is not included in the current invitation to tender. The outputs from the current invitation to tender are the 2 theories of change, the core and the enhanced theories of change, and then the evaluation plan itself. So this is a sort of implementable plan for evaluation design, outcome types, different measures, etc. And that's where this invitation to tender stops. However, TASO does have a lot of guidance on evaluation kind of strategy and planning. So what we will be able to do is signpost to existing guidance on how you might be able to operationalize that plan. But it will be a much more kind of broad and almost like a self-help approach, in the sense that you take yourself to the guidance and help navigate it. But we won't be, as part of the current tender, including like bespoke evaluation support to implement that plan. So we've got a question.
I was going to say, there's a question right at the top from Pete Krause, and I don't know if you've seen that one, Rain.
Yes, do you want to go?
Yeah, sure. So the question is concerning the EDAG. So it's for help with production of a theory of change. Is it appropriate to submit a bid for an existing project rather than a new project? Absolutely. Is it appropriate to submit a bid for a project where we've already started to draft a theory of change? Again, absolutely. And to what extent does a pre-existing draft theory of change, or even just having some literature, count positively or negatively from your perspective when looking at bids? That would count positively.
Yeah, I broadly agree. Absolutely fine to take theories of change in all kind of formats. I imagine that this is related to the ethnicity degree awarding gaps project, but it could also apply to institutional data use and support for disabled students. What we would do in this scenario, if the higher education provider was successful, is just ask for any pre-existing information, or kind of, you mentioned literature or kind of evidence reviews that already exist, and that will be our starting point, or more so the starting point of the independent evaluators, just to get across what you already know, what you already have, and we'll pick up exactly where you are, basically. So we have a couple of questions, again, a bit more on the kind of the operational side of how to submit the bids. So there's one question: can the bids be written by 2 members of faculty staff, and can they be from 2 different university contexts? this is an example of a question that I hope I've interpreted correctly. So if I haven't, please do clarify. But basically the answer is yes, you can have staff from different parts of the university working in different schools or different faculties come together to collaborate on a bid, still under the one higher education provider or higher education institution. And I'm not sure I completely understand from the two university contexts, but just to reiterate in case someone has joined the call recently, you're both welcome to apply as a single provider with staff from varying contexts or schools or faculties within your provider, but also welcome to apply as a group of separate providers who have a common interest or existing kind of collaborative working relationship, and submit one bid as a small group of providers. So either is fine. So we have, sorry, I've just lost my question. Would a proportion of the institutional overheads, so estates and indirects of calculating using track methodology, be expected in the budget? That is a very good question, and I'm not sure. I'm going to pick that up in an FAQ. So it's basically asking if we can include overheads, if higher education providers can include overhead costs in the budget. And I know it varies slightly under a grant funding model, which this is. And I don't want to give out the wrong information. So I'm going to double check that with our head of operations and include it in the FAQs. So we have a question here from Linda Greening. We are working on how to encourage students to disclose and putting things in place for those who then do disclose based on neurodiversity. Would this type of intervention count? So this is a question related to the Support for Disabled Students project. Rob, would you like to answer that?
Yes, I believe that would count. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for sure neurodivergence as a kind of broad type of intervention is certainly of interest. Another one for the Support for Disabled Students project. Is this limited to undergrad students or can it also be postgraduate students?
I honestly don't know. I was assuming it was undergraduate students.
Yeah, I have to say I have been imagining undergraduate students because that has been the focus of our first report that I've referenced, the rapid evidence review. So I think that will also be one that we take away and think about and include in the FAQs. Yeah, so I'm going to bounce that if that's okay. We still have quite a few questions coming through on EDAG, so I'm gonna come back to that. Thank you for bearing with us. We're really jumping around between projects. But a question has just come in from Jack Walker. So if you have an existing theory of change, should this be submitted alongside the application or should this just be referenced in the application? It's a very good question. We do generally take an approach of not including additional documentation in the form of kind of PDFs. I think we will stick with that just because it will be neater and fairer across all invitations to tender. But again, I'm sure this is quite obvious, if you can just reference in the application that you do have an existing theory of change, kind of indicate the process that has already been through. So kind of when was it developed and who was part of the stakeholder group who aided the development of that theory of change, and that will help us assess the application. But you will see on all invitations to tender that in general we ask for additional kind of PDF documents not to be included, just to make sure that it's a fair shortlisting process across the board. Again, on a kind of logistical question of the theories of change, so the ethnicity degree awarding gaps, if they've already been developed as part of the OFS's Wave 1 cohort who are producing APPs for 2023, would TASO consider such applications, particularly in relation to EDAG? It's a good question, and I think yes is the answer. So the logic here is that if a higher education provider is part of Wave 1 and has therefore submitted or in the process of submitting that access and participation plan to the Office for Students, they will have had to complete what we think of as a core theory of change as part of that APP process. we would still welcome those interventions to be included in this project, and certainly to be submitted as applications, because what we will be doing is taking that core theory of change as a kind of starting point and developing it into an enhanced theory of change, and then also the evaluation plan that will accompany the theory of change. So very happy to consider applications that have already been submitted as part of somebody's access and participation plan. Then we have another question. Do you envision the awarding gap project involving lots of other staff from the university? So detail about the activity, how the exercises are held, or could it be covered by a few key staff in the project? This is a really good question, and although it will vary a little bit depending on the context and the type of intervention, the blanket answer here is that it will need quite a lot of staff from across the university to be involved in the process in order to get the most out of the activity and the exercise. So the theory of change workshops that will be run by the independent evaluator that is appointed will try to include quite a range of stakeholders from across the different departments. That will be delivery staff who are actually kind of designing and implementing the activities, evaluators, possibly even some students, depending on kind of timeline and type of intervention, and then again possibly even more senior stakeholders. So buy-in and some time and resource from a range of stakeholders will be required. Good question. How are we getting on? We haven't got loads of time left. We've got another question here. So I think this is in relation to ethnicity degree awarding gaps, but again, it could be relevant to multiple projects. So am I right that we need to have a program or activity established before applying? Would these need to track or be evaluated throughout the whole university body, or could it be specific to a course or cohort? So the sort of high-level blanket response across all the projects, so the ethnicity degree awarding gaps, the institutional data use, and the support for disabled students, is that we are happy to look at established programs that have been delivered previously but perhaps not evaluated in this way, and we would look at any previous information you do have about their delivery, even if that's not a sort of rigorous evaluation. But we're also happy to take newer interventions. So it's very possible that people are currently designing and will be launching interventions starting in September, and we're also happy to look at those. They don't have to have been rolled out or delivered in the past, and equally we're very happy to look at interventions that are aimed across the university body and across the student experience, or I mean obviously it varies depending on the project, because if it's support for disabled students, it's going to be to a very specific cohort of disabled students, but if it's institutional data use, it could be specific to a cohort, and that is fine, but it also could be more general across the student body. Is there anything you want to add to that, Rob?
Yeah, I'd just say for the institutional data use project, given that we want a concrete evaluation at the end, if the programme isn't established, it will need to have generated data that we can use for evaluation purposes within the time frame of the project. And given that the project ends in March, you're looking at making sure the data's probably being generated by the end of January.
Thank you. So we've got 2 or 3 questions asking a very similar thing, which is broadly, so again, it is related to the ethnicity degree awarding gaps project. And the question is broadly, if you were to apply and were unsuccessful, how quickly will the outputs from this project be shared? So I mentioned at the very beginning that we will be publishing the 6 theories of change from the 6 higher education providers that we work with, along with the evaluation plans. And the idea is that those theories of change and evaluation plans will become almost like archetypes, or at least useful resources for the rest of the sector. So the question is around how quickly will that happen? The project will wrap in December, and we will look to publish those as soon as we can. Obviously, that is then going to fall over the winter break, so it's likely to be kind of end of January, beginning of February at earliest before those outputs are shared. But we will get them out as soon as we can, because it's definitely one of the key objectives of the project overall. we're running out of time. I think we've probably got time for one or two more questions, and everything else we will wrap into a follow-up. So for institutional data use, given the focus of type 3 evaluation, does the intervention need to be relatively large scale, or could a small N intervention work? Good question.
Preferably a large scale intervention, but we also understand that there are small N providers out there that want to produce evidence that their interventions work. And because part of the outputs of the project are around how we use data and how we code data, then it would be perfectly okay for a small intervention to work as well. And although, yes, we would prefer a type 3 evaluation, we also understand that that may not be possible, and a type 2 evaluation would also be considered.
Super, thank you, Rob. So we're going to leave it there with the questions. You will see that a new poll has just popped up. So this is just asking, did you find this session helpful in understanding the invitations to tender? Just before you all log off, if you could answer that poll, and as you do so, I'll just wrap up, which is to say thank you so much for everyone who attended. There was a lot of really great questions, and definitely some that we'll need to go away and think about, which is always a sign of a good session. There's some things we need to go away and come back to you on. So we will do that. As I've mentioned, we'll wrap up anything that we weren't able to answer into an FAQs document, and we'll publish that on the invitations to tender website page. Although if you've joined this webinar, we can also just share it in an event wrap up. So that should be really obvious. It will be in written format. We're also going to archive, or not archive, but publish this recording. So we've recorded today's session, and we will pop that Q&A up on the website as well. So feel free to kind of circulate it with any team members who maybe weren't able to attend, but may be interested in or considering applying to a tender. And then just to reiterate that these tenders will remain open for another month or so. So they're due to close on the 4th of August. And you're very welcome to submit applications on a sort of rolling basis as the weeks pass by, but equally we won't review everything in the round until the deadline has passed, and not until the deadline has passed will we go through the shortlisting process and select our preferred candidates. So thank you so much for everyone who attended and kind of joined today's session, and also for filling out the poll just now. It's really useful for us to have that indication. And yeah, have a lovely day, and we'll speak to you all soon. Take care.